Yes. How? Chazemi dog, Conkiduta Dakota Oyate Hemielo. My name is Floyd Red Crow Westerman. I am of the Dakota Nation. Medewa Kantua Hemielo. I am a Medewa Kantua descendant. And Medewa Kantua means Spirit Lake. And we are Dakota. And there are 5 bands of the Dakotas. They are the Isanti, the Ihanktuas, Yanktoni, not Yanktoni, Isanti, Ihanktua, Wakpetua, Sisetua, and Medewa Kantua. And in 1863, there was a hanging that took place in Mankato, Minnesota. And I have, some of my ancestors were hung at that time. It was the largest hanging in history. And it was because there was an uprising that my people was part of. And it was because a breaking of the treaty. When the government said we would provide the food for our people, and then when our family went to get some of what was part of the treaty that was rightfully theirs, the superintendent of the Minnesota Dakota concentration camp reservation refused to give them food. And it's a famous statement he made. He said, "Let them eat grass." So my people, in turn, turned around and stuffed his mouth with grass, killed him. And then along with other followers that pursued in the following 12 hours, the tribe had met all the warriors of the Dakotas who were on these reservations already. We were already on reservation concentration camps. And that's why we were getting this food from the government, because it was part of the treaty. If we would stay on the reservation concentration camp, they would provide the food. So this started an uprising which ended up approximately 600 white people were killed in the valley in Minnesota in a 50-mile stretch. Excuse me. And some of our people were part of the uprising, and there were some of the relatives who were not part of the uprising. Some of them had actually lived and married with some white people. And today they are called the Loyalists. And the Congress set aside specifically a certain amount of money for those descendants of Medewa Kantua in Shakopee, Minnesota. And at that time, the Congressional Act also recognized these Indians. There were 3 communities: the Shakopee community, the Prairie Island, and the Morton, Minnesota. 3 communities that were now identified, and they would have a special recognition for this land because they saved about 300 people. 300 white people, they saved them. Now these kinds of things in a war happen like this, as all wars. Now the rest of all the Indian people who were put on trial, they first were marched all the way to Minneapolis, Minnesota, to Fort Snelling. And in the middle of winter, were marched there. And Lutheran women poured boiling hot water on the women and children from the windows as they walked through the town of Mankato and all the other towns in lower Minnesota toward Minneapolis. There were atrocities that were taking place along the way, and after they were all taken to Minnesota, the men were all separated from the women, and the women, old men, and children were put in a stockade there at Fort Snelling, where they lived out and endured the rest of the winter in incredible conditions. The men who were separated were kept down in Mankato. 350 of them were supposed to be hanged. This was at the time of the Civil War was still going on. Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States, and all the public wanted all Indian people to be hung. And so President Lincoln, as a result of the pressures both ways, and being at Christmas time, being forced by Christians to see some leniency, he only signed an order to hang 38 of my ancestors, some of who are my relative, who were hanged in the streets of Mankato on a chilly day, the day after Christmas. So I think, when we think of that, it was the largest hanging in the U.S. history. I am producing a documentary about the American Holocaust. That was going to be one of the lead stories in this passage. So, in the telling of the Holocaust story, the American public should know that what they now know as reservations were really concentration camps in the beginning. They were called reservations to minimize really what they were. We couldn't walk our land, we couldn't leave the reservation anymore, we couldn't dance, we couldn't sing our songs, we couldn't speak our language. All these things were imposed upon our people. So in a sense, we were put upon a Holocaust, put upon us. And the militias went around to all the rest of the state areas and rounded up all the Dakotas, and they were forced into concentration camps in place where the Sisetawan Reservation is in South Dakota, Crow Creek Reservation, to Fort Totten, North Dakota, and some fled into Canada. So the present day condition of Indian people throughout the country is still in a concentration camp lifestyle, because after the treaties were signed and then we were, in other words, agreed to stay on the reservation concentration camp areas, the government would provide food. And the food they then provided was flour, lard, sugar, salt. Flour, lard, sugar, salt, and then canned meats, which were most of the time spoiled. So people died from food poisoning. That throughout Minnesota, throughout the East Coast, throughout on the West Coast, smallpox blankets were handed out to Indian people that were infected with smallpox, and Indian people died. And it was used as a measure of decimating the population. And this kind of act is, in today's terms, was called biological warfare. So this country had concentration camp before Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany got the idea from America. Most Americans might be in denial of what happened here, and consequently they gloss over the story of what did happen, what took place here. And it's a sanitized form of history that they teach their generations.